we are nearing the end of this whole risk assessment process. The whole reason why we have done all the analysis and the listing of the scope of work, the listing of the hazards, the incidents, why we gave a risk rating, is to get to this stage where we can treat the risks in the most effective and cost and resource effective way. And the whole purpose is that we want to get to a position where we have controls in place, where we have barriers in place that will protect people when they are working against accidental or harmful release by hazards. Now, there are quite a few ways to look at when we're looking at treating risks. The first thing that you can do when you've got risk exposure, in other words, where you're exposed to a hazard and there's a possibility of unwanted events happening, is to avoid exposure to that hazard. If you don't want to get bitten by a dog, the best is not to go where there are dogs. If you don't want to get hit by cars, go to places where there are no cars. Go somewhere else. That's not always possible, unfortunately, in life. Sometimes we have to go to places where we get more exposure to hazards because that's where we earn our money. Another one is retention. We can also share the exposure to the risk. We can transfer the risk, and we can apply loss prevention and reduction. So let's have a look. I've already touched on avoidance. If you don't want to get lung cancer, or at least if you don't want to get lung cancer from cigarettes or from vaping, then you don't smoke. You go to places where you don't have to inhale other people's smoke, and you don't vape. It's not a guarantee that you're not going to get lung cancer, but at least you avoid the risk of getting lung cancer from smoking. What is retention of risk? Sometimes we talk about risk tolerance. Risk tolerance means that I'm exposed to the risk, I can't avoid it, and I have to just manage it as good as I can. An example is that we know that there are road accidents on the roads every day. We know that people don't follow the traffic rules. We know that when I'm in town, people are skipping red lights and they are driving over stop streets. Early in the morning when they come back from partying, they're under the influence of alcohol. So what do I need to do? I need to be aware of those factors, because now I am extra careful when I get to the red traffic light, and I make sure that there's nobody when I get to the green traffic light and it's red for somebody else, I look and make sure that there's nobody approaching that crossing at speed, and I look for signs that he is not going to stop. And if he's not going to stop, I don't go through the red light. So that's retention. Retention is I have to go and work in the factory. In the factory there are many hazards like noise, fumes, chemicals, moving machinery. I maybe don't have the choice not to work in this factory. Might be the only place that I can find work. That's where I need to earn my money so that I can feed my family and provide for all their needs. So when I go into that environment, I have to go there and I have to manage the circumstances and my behavior such that I can reduce the likelihood of an event, or I can mitigate the consequences should one happen. Okay, so retaining a risk means that you're going to live with it and manage it. Sharing, sometimes I want to buy something but I can't afford all the money, and so what we do is two of us engage in the same transaction and we contribute half, and therefore there's half the chance that we will not be able to afford whatever we've got. Sharing also means that I have to work along with somebody else to reduce the risks. When you and I go into the same workplace, then we share this exposure. We've got a common goal, and that is to go home safely this afternoon. So I will look after you, and you will look after me to make sure that we don't engage in substandard behavior and go into substandard conditions. Transferring the risk normally means that we give it to somebody else. Now, in terms of health and safety, that could mean that I am not going to manufacture certain things that might be dangerous to manufacture. I'm just going to buy it. Somebody else can take that risk. Our companies, we take out public liability insurance, so that should something go wrong and I have liability to compensate somebody for an accident or an incident or a mistake, then the insurance will step in and they will pay that on my behalf, provided that I paid my monthly installments. It's the same with the workman's compensation when we register with the COID, under the COID Act. If somebody gets hurt while he's in my employ, that person will still have insurance to cover his medical expenses, even if my business might be bankrupt and I cannot provide for that cost. So that's how we transfer the risk. I either let somebody else do it and I get some of the benefit of that and I pay a price, and that can be insurance, can be manufacturing, a lot of those things. Another option is loss prevention and reduction. That's what we do with health and safety management, is we do risk assessments, we put controls in place, we train people, we provide supervision, we enforce the rules, we act when things are not right, and we have emergency plans in place so that if something goes wrong, that we can stop it from escalating and we can mitigate the circumstances. So that is loss prevention and reduction. How can I treat the risks that I retain, the ones that I said that we are going to tolerate? I can't get rid of them. I can't transfer them to somebody else. I have to manage them. Well, I can still choose not to get engaged in the risk. I can take the risk. Maybe there's an opportunity waiting at the end of the line. I can invest in some products. There's a risk that I may lose my money, but there's also a possibility that I may grow my money. So all risks are not necessarily threats. Some of them are opportunities to become richer. When you start your own company, that is an opportunity that you are grabbing that may end up losing all your money, or you may end up having a good, strong business and earn a lot and save a lot of money. I can remove the risk source. In other words, if there's toxic chemicals in my area, I can remove the toxic chemical and get rid of it so that I can't get it in. For instance, if at home your children might be exposed to old medicine or chemicals, you put it in, you take it, you either throw it away, get rid of it, or what you do is you go and put it in a place where they can't reach it. Something else that I can do if I want to reduce the risks that I am retaining is I can reduce the likelihood. In other words, the fewer chances I get for this accident to happen by better control, by less exposure, by doing a dangerous thing less often, I reduce the likelihood of a harmful event happening. I can change the consequences. I can wear PPE. I can put shock-absorbing barriers or force-absorbing barriers. I can deflect. I can put space and distance between the hazard and the target. I can share the risks like contracts, joining with partners, doing things together, get somebody to give finances, I give the skill, working together on the same project so that I don't carry one heavy thing, I don't work alone in a dangerous environment. We have a buddy-buddy system. Those are all examples of sharing risks. And by sharing the risk, I reduce the risk for every participating party. When you retain a risk, at least you retain it by informed decision. Sometimes you have to retain it because that's part of your livelihood, comes with the job. But at least because you've done a good risk assessment, you now know that you have that risk. And if the only thing that is left for you to do is to reduce the likelihood and the consequence, well, then at least you know that you have to do so and you can take action. When we are treating risks, when we have retained the risks and we are trying to manage them, the best way of reducing risk is to eliminate, physically remove the thing that is going to cause the harm. If you are working somewhere and you find there's a bomb, what's the best way to protect people? Well, that bomb has to be removed. If there's a dangerous machine or a dangerous animal or toxic chemicals, whatever there is, if that presents harm or possibility of harm to people, the best way to deal with it is to just get rid of it. If it's not there, it cannot close onto the target, and it cannot release energy onto the target. However, it's not always possible. For instance, best way to prevent car accidents is to get rid of all the cars. But that's not going to work because our economy and society depends on vehicles to get things done. So I can't get rid of the cars, so I'm left with the next best thing, and that is substitution. Substitution means that I replace one thing with another one. An example is electricians. They will use a sharp knife, a Stanley knife or something like that, to do cable stripping. But that is a dangerous tool because it's a very sharp blade. If I force it, if I don't use it correctly, people have, they've been cut very badly by themselves when that tool slipped. Hands, fingers, arms, very badly. It's a very dangerous tool if not used correctly or if something goes wrong. Now there are things that we call cable strippers and wire strippers. It's a piece of equipment that we can put there. It cannot cut my fingers, and I can strip cables and electrical wires using a cable stripping tool. So I replace the dangerous knife with a custom-built tool, and therefore I cannot cut myself with a Stanley knife anymore. The next thing that I can do, and this is in a level of effectiveness. Elimination is the most effective way of dealing with a risk and a hazard, and PPE is probably the least effective way of dealing with risks and hazards. Unfortunately, in real life, people jump immediately to things like PPE, and they jump to rules and procedures and checklists rather than fixing things through, for instance, engineering controls. Engineering controls takes a little bit longer, it does normally take more effort, and it takes more time and money because I need to physically redesign things. I need to put guards on, I need to put safeguards on there so that a machine can trip, so that people cannot reach moving parts. I need to put barriers up between vehicles and pedestrians. Those are the kind of things that are engineering controls. They are normally a redesign or an addition or a modification to the circumstances with physical barriers and other means that will stop a hazard from hurting a target. The next one I've already spoken about. That is administrative controls. Those are all the things that you have to supervise. You have to put them in place. You've got to manage them. You've got to check them. People have got to be trained to do them. So it's all these processes and procedures that people have to do, which often they do not do. And then lastly, I've spoken about PPE. Why is PPE the least effective? Because the hazard has already been allowed to release harmful energy in some way. And the barriers that I took to prevent this harmful release of energy that's now going to cause an incident and damage, that is now on the way to the target. That target is a person in many cases. I have lost control over this target. All I can now expect is that the PPE, the personal protective equipment that a person is wearing, is sufficient to absorb a lot of this energy and not result in a serious injury or a fatality. I wear safety glasses because I expect flying projectiles to come towards me, and I put the glasses so that it doesn't hit my eye. But if the force is greater than the protection of the safety glasses, I may still go blind. I wear a mask. If I don't wear that mask correctly, whatever I'm trying to protect myself against leaks into my airways and into my body, and it doesn't help. We've seen that with COVID a lot of the time, people not wearing masks correctly. So administrative controls and PPE controls are things that you have to push all the time. Now the slides just repeat what I've basically said. Elimination removes the hazard at the source. Substitution, you replace a more dangerous thing with a less dangerous thing. You reduce exposure. You capture the energy of the hazard through engineering controls. And engineering controls of all of these items, apart from elimination, is probably the most effective ones. Then administration, which I've spoken about, work process training procedures, inspections, checklists, job rotation, rest breaks, limiting access, managing speed, and so on. PPE, we've also spoken about. We protect ourselves against these hazards. We know what they are. We wear gloves, hard hats, overalls, dust masks, welding shields, face shields, safety shoes, boots, fall arrest equipment, and so on. We need to match our PPE to the hazards. I can't wear, for instance, a dust mask to protect me against chemical fumes. A dust mask is made to protect physical particles, and chemical fumes will just come straight through and go into my body where it shouldn't be. I need a special chemical mask to protect myself against the welding fumes and chemical fumes and so on. Respirators with special filters, for instance. So if I use PPE, I've got to make sure that this matches the hazard. I can use gloves, but if my gloves are not made of the right material to protect me against the chemical, it may dissolve the glove, or it may even, without me knowing, penetrate through the material of the glove and still cause harm. The problem with administrative controls and PPE is that they are like a wheelbarrow. If somebody is not standing behind that wheelbarrow and pushing it and making sure that it moves, over time people stop applying the administrative controls. They don't wear their PPE, they don't follow the rules, they don't apply their training, they don't do the checklists, and things deteriorate until we get to a point where that barrier fails and the hazard energy can then come through and cause damage to the target. So administrative controls always take a lot more work. And in our SHE files, often we are requested to have checklist upon checklist and index upon index. It takes a lot of work to maintain those things. So if I can, let me eliminate, substitute, or engineer out the hazard. Now, how do I find information to tell me what I should be doing to control hazards? Easy. There are lots of sources. Firstly, the legislation, the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations, the ergonomic regulations, hazardous chemicals regulations, construction regulations, they already specify minimum requirements that I have to apply because they have learnt before they drew up the legislation, they've learnt that if we don't do those specific things, then the hazards that are present in, for instance, construction or hazardous chemicals will cause harm. So you don't have to relearn the lesson. It's already been learnt. It's written into the legislation what you should be doing, like inspections, making sure that they comply to minimum standards, doing certain assessments like ergonomic assessments, hazardous chemical exposure assessments. You need to do noise-induced hearing loss. You need to provide hearing protection, and so on and so on. It also says for certain work like confined space entry, hot work permits, and those kind of things, what you need to do. Firstly, you need to do a risk assessment. Then you need to do a permit, and you need to have a plan to make sure that those hazards that are present are under control, and you need a plan to rescue people should something go wrong. I can also find the recommended controls in technical information. If you buy an angle grinder or a machine, it will tell you in the instruction manual what you should do to keep yourself safe. If you buy hazardous chemicals, if you use hazardous chemicals, you will get a safety data sheet that will tell you these are the characteristics of this chemical, this is how it may hurt you, these are the precautionary measures, and these are the first aid measures that you need to apply. I can go on training manuals and courses. People that are skilled artisans have been trained over months and years to work with the tools that they have and to work safely with the tools that they have. Often, the client will give us minimum requirements. So the client will give us standard operating procedures, checklists, and whatever that they expect us to implement for control of the hazards, that if we have those hazards in our scope of work, our site, and so on. Also, there's a very good place to find other information, and that's the internet. Google, all kinds of search engines that you can go and use, and you can type in safety measures or precautions or safety instructions for angle grinders. You can get safety data sheets for chemicals there. You can get checklists and instruction on how to use and inspect ladders. You will get guidelines for scaffolding. Lots and lots and lots of information available on the internet, which I didn't have when I was a kid or even a young person. I had to go and read on in encyclopedia, and then fortunately we had Chappies, and in the Chappies papers they told us, how did you know? So we got a lot of information from Chappies papers. I'm just joking. So lots of sources of the hazard characteristics and the control measures that you need to make or to put in place to make sure that that hazard does not impact on you. I said earlier that we can put controls in place to reduce the likelihood of an event happening. An example would be traffic signs and signals. If we all obeyed the traffic signs and signals, instead of just treating them like guidelines and otherwise ignoring them, then we would know what the other person is doing, because the traffic light says that person has to stop and I can go. But if he doesn't obey that and I go through the area where I'm allowed to go, he will strike me because he didn't follow the rules. So things like rules, traffic signs, maintenance, inspections, job planning, supervision, those are all kind of things designed to prevent incidents from happening in the first place. We want to see that people are working safely, that the conditions are in order, and they are maintaining this, and that they are taking precautionary steps all the way. Then we will prevent incidents from happening, or at least not totally. We will dramatically reduce the likelihood. However, should something happen and an incident still happens, then I need to have mitigating measures in place. So I have this whole book of traffic rules and traffic signs, and people have to go for a license, and then they have to follow the traffic rules and so on. But because I know that people don't do that, or because me myself, I don't follow that rules, I know that there's still a possibility of me being in a vehicle accident. So what I do is I also have a seat belt, and I also have an airbag. And the whole idea of those is if I am in a collision, what will happen is the seat belt and the airbag will absorb the energy, and I won't smash my face against the windscreen or the steering wheel. Safety belts are also there for people in the back seat to be worn, because if they are not belted down, what's going to happen if I stop suddenly, like in the picture, and they keep traveling, then they are going to come over the seat and kill me, even though I was strapped down. So, preventative measures and mitigating measures. Prevention is trying to stop the injury from happening. Mitigation is give the guy PPE so that if he cuts or if he slips, then the sharp object will catch the glove or the protective clothing first. And if he still gets cut, then we have mitigating measures like first aid, medical treatment to make sure that he doesn't bleed to death and the wound doesn't get infected and that he can actually recover. What we need to do is focus on the preventive. So do whatever you can from an elimination, substitution, engineering controls, training and procedure. Do as much as you can there to prevent incidents from happening. In the previous chapter, we discussed the evaluation of risks. What we did is we looked at the hazard, the incidents associated with the hazard. We then said the likelihood of one of these incidents that involves the hazard is the following: low, medium, high, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D. And we said if that incident should happen, then the severity of the consequence could be a first aid case, a fatality, or anything in between. When we did that risk assessment, we did not have controls in place to protect the targets. That was what we call a raw risk assessment, or an inherent risk assessment, or an initial, not risk assessment, risk evaluation. So that assesses the danger of this hazard without any controls. Now we have the opportunity to put controls in place. Eliminate, substitute, engineer them out, put administrative things in place like procedures, inspections, training, and so on, and wear PPE. The ultimate goal is that we want to reduce the likelihood or the severity of the incidents. So the next stage that you need to do in your assignment or in your risk assessment is to list those controls. So those are the things that we are going to do. Once we've got these controls in place, we need to implement them. And when we implement them, we need to go back and we need to go and have a look. If I do the training, if I put the guarding on the machine, if I put the following supervision in place, am I making a difference to the exposure of my people? Am I reducing the likelihood of an incident? Or if there is an incident, are they now better protected? If the answer is no, so if I do the risk assessment of the hazard with the controls in place and I ask, with all of these controls, what is now the likelihood of an event occurring, an incident occurring. And with all of these controls in place, what will the severity of the consequences be if there is an event? And those numbers don't come down, so that the risk rating don't come down, then what I have done, I've wasted my time on all of these controls. Because what I'm doing is I'm doing a lot of stuff that makes no difference. I can have all the checklists, all the procedures, all the training that I want. If I don't implement them, if I don't follow them, and if they don't reduce the likelihood and the severity of an incident, I may as well save my money and do nothing and just take the initial exposure to the hazard in the first place, because then I'm not doing anything to protect people. So the secret when you develop controls and would you put barriers in place, it must make a difference to the likelihood and the severity or the severity of the incident. Just to fill in paper, just to have inspections for the sake of inspection to make somebody happy, that serves no purpose at all. Remember, controls must reduce the likelihood or the severity.